Good evening and welcome to our December First Thursday speaker series. My name is Liz McCart and I am a volunteer at Chatham Marconi. Just as a reminder, you can hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen and type in a question during the presentation using the Q&A icon. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Our final program for this year is about the Battle of the Atlantic. Tonight's presentation will focus on activities that took place off the East Coast, in particular, North Carolina. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Joe Hoyt. Joe is a maritime archaeologist with NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. He specializes in archaeological recording of deep water shipwrecks and worked on several NOAA projects in the Thunder Bay, Florida Keys, and Monitor National Marine Sanctuary since 2001. He has worked on underwater archaeology projects across the world. Joe is also an avid underwater photographer and technical diver and has crewed documentary expeditions on BBC's Planet Earth and PBS. For the last 10 years, Joe has been the chief scientist on a multifaceted, wide area investigation of World War II era shipwrecks lost off the coast of North Carolina. In 2014, he led a team of researchers that discovered the final resting place of a World War II battlefield off that coast, consisting of a German U-boat, U-576, and its victim, a Nicaraguan flagged freighter, Bluefields. He earned his MA in Maritime History and Nautical Archaeology from East Carolina University and serves on the Advisory Council for Underwater Archaeology. Thanks for joining us tonight, Joe, and I'll now turn this over to you for the presentation.
My pleasure. Thanks. I'm happy to be here. I wish I could be there in person instead of virtually, but this will have to do for now. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share some of the work that I've been involved in over the last many years with the community there at the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center. So super excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Is that up and running?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, as Liz said, my name is Joe Hoyt. I work for a program called the National Marine Sanctuaries, part of the NOAA's, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We're a program that protects special places in the ocean. And we have a system of sites across the US and in the US territorial waters that protect these special places for anything from coral reefs to humpback whales to maritime heritage resources. And it's just an incredible collection of these special places that are set aside for the American public to learn about the ocean, learn about history, and preserve those incredible resources for future generations. It's really an unbelievable place to work and an unbelievable network. It's similar in design to national parks. A lot of people are more familiar with national parks because you can drive into those. These are all in the ocean, all underwater places that are protected by NOAA. And it's just an incredible network. And we do have, the majority of these sites protect ecological resources, natural resources. We do have a few sites that specialize in archaeological resources, predominantly shipwrecks. But most every site in the system has maritime heritage, cultural resources, and other cultural engagement that is ongoing. So to that end, we have a national program called the Maritime Heritage Program, which is where I work to address cultural issues across the network. So towards that end, I have been engaged, and what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is some work that we've been doing off of the coast of North Carolina. Our program, as I mentioned, protects special places And we've been engaged with protecting the shipwreck of the USS Monitor since 1975, and spending about 40 years of time in North Carolina, you can't help but notice that there's a lot of other shipwrecks there as well. And for about the last 12 years or so, we've embarked on a study to do an inventory of resources off North Carolina that are representative of the Battle of the Atlantic. So what I'm going to talk tonight about is the Battle of the Atlantic and the American theater of World War II. This is a subject that's very dear to me, as I've spent the better part of the last more than a decade focusing on this research. But it's a really interesting element of World War II history that's not very well known. When most people think about World War II, they think about faraway places in Europe and the South Pacific, Iwo Jima, Normandy, things that happened over there. And with the exception of Pearl Harbor, most of the activity in the minds of the American public is just that. It's something that it was a foreign war that we became engaged in after it had already been going on for a couple of years. And we sent our troops away from the United States, and all the activity was fought elsewhere. That's kind of the mental landscape that people have associated with World War II. But the reality is there was activity that was happening just at our doorstep here off the U.S. East Coast in particular. There were ships being sunk with impunity for much of the early part of 1942 within sight of shore. And people don't know that. I talk to, whenever I sort of talk about this subject, there's a German U-boat that was sunk off the coast of North Carolina, which I'll talk a little bit about later, called the U-85. And it's about 14 miles off of Oregon Inlet in North Carolina. And that is less than my commute to work. It seems like it's far out in the ocean and over the horizon, but it's so close how close these things came to the U.S. coastline, and it's just not well known. And we've been working on trying to make that history more understood and celebrated, because it's such an important element, and it's really an interesting aspect of the war that has not really had its due. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Battle of the Atlantic in general, what it was, what the kind of main objectives were, and then how it was represented off the East Coast, and in particular how North Carolina represents this idea of a battlefield. So this is a great quote from Winston Churchill: "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." This is it's kind of hard to overestimate or overstate the significance of the U-boat threat. This is a war on commerce. It's a tactic that is as old as war itself, to cut off enemy supply lines. But here in World War II, it's a global war, and those supply lines are global. And to a large degree, the European theater, the war effort in the European theater, relied heavily on raw materials and produced goods that were coming in via sea transport, merchant mariners carrying those cargoes over the ocean, delivering them to Europe, delivering them to the UK, that are going to fuel RAF planes doing bombing raids, bringing in all those raw materials, principally oil. And so oil was coming out of the Gulf of Mexico, running up the East Coast of the United States, crossing the North Atlantic, and coming into Europe to offload their cargoes and return to collect more. So it was really a massive artery. And the thinking on the part of the German Navy was, if they could cut off that artery, they would really limit the ability for the Allied powers to wage war in the European theater. And this was a strategy that was very successful for them in World War I, and they doubled down in World War II and really created an oceanic battlefield that we're still studying to this day. So it's incredible what when you think about the Battle of the Atlantic, the scale of it, it really is an oceanic war. And the Germans, one of the reasons that they engaged in U-boat warfare was because following the loss of World War I, there were sanctions placed on their shipbuilding in the interwar period that prevented them from building up a capital fleet, a surface fleet that would be competitive with the British particularly. And so it was known that they would have a great deal of difficulty competing in a traditional surface navy. So more and more as the war progressed, they invested more heavily in U-boats, which were able to disrupt traffic and evade those surface vessels. So just to give you an idea of some of the scale of it, just in North Carolina alone, between the months of January and July of 1942, a total of 91 vessels were lost off North Carolina or damaged. And vast majority of those were merchant vessels made up of many nations that were transiting through the area carrying war material and raw goods. 79 merchant ships, 8 Allied naval ships, those are anti-submarine trawlers and patrol boats, and 4 German submarines just off North Carolina. It's an incredible amount of destruction in a short amount of time. So the Battle of the Atlantic, it started really at the very beginning of the war and it ran right through the end. It was scope and scale, the largest battlefield on the planet. And it, for the United States, we became engaged in World War II. We were supporting the Battle of the Atlantic through Lend-Lease and having some of our ships reallocated to support Allied efforts prior to our formal entry into the war in December of 1941. But it wasn't until Pearl Harbor that the Americans formally entered the war effort. And so when Pearl Harbor happened, which we're coming up on the anniversary of here on Monday, on December 7th of 1941, on the 11th, Hitler declared war on the United States. And by January 18th, just barely a month later, the first ships are being sunk off the coast off the East Coast of the United States. So an unbelievable immediacy to the U-boat threat off the East Coast. And interestingly, and I'll talk a little bit about this as we dig into some of the more detail. Interestingly, the timing of this entry was particularly problematic because there were some code-breaking setbacks that were taking place at this time, and the American sentiments for the support of World War II were heavily biased to the Pacific theater because of Pearl Harbor. So a lot of our surface fleet power was focused in the Pacific theater initially, which left the U.S. East Coast largely unprotected. So you'll see this sort of trend of these small, converted fishing trawlers, commercial vessels that were converted to do service that they were never really intended to do and fight and combat the threat of U-boats. The result of this was a pretty lopsided victory, and at least in the early stages of the Battle of the Atlantic off the East Coast for the German U-boat arm. So as I mentioned, from the beginning of about mid-January, about January 18th, the first ship is sunk off North Carolina, and there are multiple ships sunk, almost a ship a day if you average it out. It wasn't until April 14th, so almost 4 months before the first U-boat was sunk off the East Coast. So there's a 4-month window where every ship that's being sunk is completely on the Allied side of the house. And it took a good amount of time before our anti-submarine warfare capabilities got to the point where they could effectively mitigate the threat of U-boats off the East Coast. So the result of this, of course, is an unbelievable landscape of destruction, and in the form of shipwrecks that litter the East Coast. And as we started to kind of consider this, this sort of activity that took place, how do you really conceptualize the Battle of the Atlantic? Because it's so huge. It's literally an ocean. There were areas of intense activity, but this took place in the North Atlantic, all down the eastern seaboard, into the Gulf of Mexico, on the coast of Europe and Africa, down to South America. I mean, it truly was an oceanic war. But so how do we memorialize a place like this? When we think of other battlefields that are important in U.S. history or world history, we set aside these places. We set aside places like Gettysburg. We set aside places like Manassas and Shiloh and Little Bighorn, and these are kind of definable places where something pivotal happened. How do you do that in the ocean, where things are out of sight, things are inaccessible, and the scale is huge? And that's really our challenge, is understanding this so that we could memorialize it appropriately. And here you see just off North Carolina alone, over almost 1,700 casualties just off North Carolina, 1,200 of which were merchant mariners. And so as we dig deeper into this history, you really start to see this story of the merchant marine emerge, and the sacrifice that was made on the part of merchant mariners to carry those goods and deliver that war material was unbelievably critical to the war effort. And the sacrifice and loss of life for folks serving in the merchant marine was steep. It was actually the highest statistical likelihood of loss of life over any of the armed services. So you had a higher probability of losing your life as a merchant mariner in World War II than you did as a Marine or as any other part of the Army or the Navy. So it was unbelievably dangerous to do this and critically important. Yet the merchant mariners did not have the same veteran status. It wasn't until the 1980s that they received some partial veteran status, and they're still fighting today to be recognized for their critical role in World War II. So that's another important element as we see this place. Why do we care? Why do we want to understand these places? Is to really celebrate and pay respect to the sacrifices that were made that haven't really been recognized appropriately. So this again is this is happening from really the point of entry into the war, and it continues throughout the war. Although we start to see that there's these areas that emerge as hotspots, as places that are really strategically important. It's happening everywhere, but it's also there's also areas that have particular significance. And one of these areas is North Carolina. And so the way that we've begun to kind of conceptualize this as a battlefield is, we obviously, sure would be nice if we could say the whole Atlantic Ocean is recognized as a battlefield. I think that's probably true, but we can't do that. We can't manage that. So we have to focus in and try to understand this in some discrete places. And there's really no better place to do that off the East Coast than off of North Carolina. So as we conceptualize this place as a battlefield, rather than just a collection of individual shipwreck sites, we're showing how they're interconnected and how they actually operated in this landscape, in the physical environment, but also in sort of the technological environment with the limitations of the systems that they had for waging war, for tracking themselves, for communications. All of these things kind of come together to give us a much better understanding of this place as a battlefield. And again, I mentioned some of these land battlefield sites that many of you may have had an opportunity to visit. And when we think of this place as a battlefield, or we have this concept of what we call battlefield archaeology, where we're looking at how people operated in these places, it's relatively intuitive to go to a terrestrial battlefield site and stand in that place and be able to kind of picture maybe what it would have been like to be there, and you could see, an area where you have some high ground that would give you some strategic advantage. You can see, an earthenwork berm that would offer you some protection for concealment. You can see a tree line, you could see a river, and you could understand how troop movements might be affected by these things. But when we look at the ocean, we stand there and we look at the ocean, we see a flat surface, right? Well, it's flat on nice days. Sometimes it's a little bumpy, but generally you just see this flat plane, and it's kind of featureless at first glance, but it's not. There's a lot going on there, and our job is to understand this is to try to model these things and understand how they influenced things strategically, and how they still influence why these places today are have these incredible resources for us to visit and study. So North Carolina, just to kind of go over some of these parameters of a battlefield, has a number of these features, some of which are static, just natural features in the landscape, and others are sort of ephemeral, weather, cloud cover, temperature, the state of technology at the time, the limitations of the systems being utilized. So those things all have to be kind of taken into account. And so when we look at this place, again, it's not a flat, featureless landscape. There's, and one of the things, I'll back up a second, one of the things that's really interesting about this idea of a battlefield in World War II is if you consider this understanding naval tactics throughout history, where it's principally surface vessels that are engaged in fighting. It really is that flat planar surface that they're operating on. Maybe there's some areas, where you're adjacent to shore that have some strategic significance. You're positioning for the weather gauge and sailing vessels. But generally speaking, the actions were limited to that surface plane of the surface of the ocean. Now, in World War II, we have that surface plane still in play, but we also have aircraft taking a much more significant role than they ever had in other previous conflicts. So you have the atmospheric column, where you have air cover operating in these spaces. And then you also have the water column, because now we have a huge amount of subsurface activity with the prevalence of U-boats and submarines. So it's really, for the first time in World War I and World War II, this sort of 3D landscape where it's the surface, the air, and the sea. So the bottom topography that is covered by the ocean comes into account, as well as the oceanic currents themselves that influence the shipping lanes. It's really a dynamic system that we're trying to understand how people are working in here. So if you look at this image here, you'll see that the Gulf Stream, which comes up out of the Gulf and hits Cape Hatteras there and hangs a right and heads off conveniently towards Europe. This was a natural thoroughfare for maritime commerce since the discovery of the New World. And I always kind of think of it as like a moving walkway in an airport. You get in there and it gives you an extra couple knots of speed as you head back to Europe. So that was sort of a natural trade route that comes across the Cape there. And if you look at this right image, you'll see the proximity of the continental shelf. It comes very close to North Carolina, and the significance of that is that U-boats, they're preferentially an offensive weapon. They're a very lousy defensive weapon. So they would hide, attack, and then evade. And having access to heavily concentrated shipping routes, but also access to deep water to avoid counterattack was sort of the perfect recipe. And that recipe is best had off of North Carolina. If you see how far away the continental shelf goes from areas further north like Boston and New York Harbor, there's a huge concentration of shipping up there, but the continental shelf is in some places more than 100 miles offshore. So the U-boats, if they were attacking ships there, they couldn't dive deep enough to evade counterattack. And interestingly, the U-boats were capable of, at this time, they were capable of diving much deeper than U.S. submarines. So at the time, U.S. submarines were capable of diving to about 250 feet. And so we designed depth charges to attack German submarines. Well, what do you think we did with our depth charge design? There's no way the Germans could be diving deeper than us, so we'll just max these out at 250 feet. So our depth charges for a time couldn't go any deeper than that, but a U-boat could dive to 750 feet. And so they were able to access deep water, and this kind of comes into play as I'll talk a little bit about the U-576 here shortly. So again, this kind of perfect storm of natural features in the environment that dictated the landscape. There's all sorts of other interesting things that are happening. I mentioned sort of these ephemeral elements. And this is where sort of intelligence comes involved, and civil servants as well as military personnel that have a huge active role in determining the outcome of these engagements. So one of the things I always think is really interesting, and of course NOAA being the Weather Service, this is near and dear to our hearts. But the weather itself during World War II was considered top secret. There was massive networks of weather stations, both on the Axis and Allied side, that had the sole goal of having good weather information, but also restricting that information so that it wouldn't influence enemy tactics to thwart anything from troop movements, ship movements to farming and agriculture. So it's a really interesting time, and the technology that was available was largely what you see there in the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center. The weather reporting was part of the battle, but then transferring that information was an enormous feat. So the technology of communications played a massive role in the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. So principally, these were focused on weather reporting and also position reporting of where enemy vessels might be and how to route convoys to avoid enemy vessels and effectively establish counter tactics. So this all had a massive role in sort of shaping the look and feel of how these vessels operated in these spaces. One of the, I would be remiss not to mention the Coast Guard cutter Muskeget, which was the only weather service vessel lost during World War II. That was just 4 civilian weathermen were just recently honored in 2015 and posthumously awarded the Purple Heart. Is a great point to demonstrate the value of merchant mariners, of civil service members that were contributing to the war effort, in addition to the armed forces themselves. So I mentioned the role of communications. There's an entire field that focuses on signals intelligence. And signals intelligence just means collecting information based on electronic signals. And this is where the Marconi wireless was so critical to the way that particularly vessels offshore moved, communicated, and conducted strategic and tactical maneuvers. So to simplify it, what the station there in Chatham was a part of was, and this is an image down here on the bottom right of what it would have looked like in 1942. And they were principally engaged in listening to a broad range of frequencies, trying to intercept radio transmissions to identify the location of these U-boats that were operating offshore. And the way that they would do this is the wireless signals would be transmitted from a U-boat that would do something like report the weather back to the U-boat command, or report its position to, or claim that it sunk a vessel. Whatever communications it's doing, it's sending out a radio signal. And when that radio signal is sent out, it can be picked up by stations like the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center. And if you have these listening stations have something called radio direction finders. And what they would do is essentially determine the direction that the transmission was received from. And it could tell along a straight line, somewhere in this straight line is where this signal is coming from. And if you could detect that same signal from another station, you could then determine where those two lines intersected and have a very good idea of the location, the point of origin from that transmission. And that was absolutely critical to convoy routing and to anti-submarine warfare throughout the entire war. Now, because that was critical and these signals were easily intercepted, an unbelievable, there's movies and books and stories just about the encryption of these transmissions. You'll see here at the top, this is the famous Enigma machine, an encryption device that was used for these wireless transmissions on the U-boats. And I mentioned earlier that there was sort of this kind of perfect storm of the timing of World War II, or America's entry into World War II, is that we had gotten really good, the Allied powers, particularly the British, had gotten really good at intercepting and decoding German transmissions. Almost to the point where they just sort of, they had cracked the Enigma machine and were pretty confidently reading most German transmissions. And the feeling at the time in 1941 was, yeah, we got this covered, we got this figured out, we're good to go. Well, right about the time in the fall of 1941, the Germans introduced a fourth rotor to the Enigma machine. And to give just a very quick description of how these devices worked, you would have a series of encoded rotors on a cylindrical drum that you'd have to have a specific key code that would transfer the whatever letter you typed. It would go through, initially it was 3 rotors to spit out the encoded message on the other side. And the addition of each rotor sort of exponentially makes that calculation of what it might be more difficult. So when they added the fourth rotor, it prevented the Allied powers from reading these encrypted messages for a significant period of time until they could then crack that fourth rotor device. So these transmissions were stunted. And we could determine position, radio direction finding, and make some determinations of point of origin, but we were unable to read the actual transmissions themselves for a period of time following the entry of the Americans into World War II. So what we've been doing since about 2008 is trying to understand all of these different parameters. It's very complicated, and additionally, there are many shipwreck sites that are littered across the bottom of the Outer Banks in North Carolina. So we began this comprehensive assessment and inventory of the wrecks that are out there and trying to understand their relationships and how they sort of interconnect with each other, rather than looking at them as just one particular story, one particular instance of a ship being attacked. We're looking at them collectively to tell this bigger story and understand all these connections. So this is just gives you kind of an idea of some of the GIS modeling that we've done to identify areas of particular concentration of activity. You can see, of course, right off Cape Hatteras is the highest density of activity that took place. This kind of confirms what we're reading about in war diaries and U-boat journals. And it was known that Hatteras was a place that was treacherous for merchant mariners and a place where U-boat commanders could go and make a name for themselves. They were incentivized to sink tonnage. The amount of tonnage sunk equated to various reward levels, and Hatteras was a place that they knew that they could come and really do some damage. So we started to kind of model these sites and understand these places, and then document the sites themselves. There's a couple of there's 4 U-boats that were lost off North Carolina. These are the U-85 and the U-352. The 85 was the first one that was sunk. I mentioned in April 14th of 1942. That's just, again, 14 miles off of Oregon Inlet in North Carolina. The 352, the U-701, all of these sites are within 25 miles of the beach, unbelievably close to shore. So we started to understand all these wrecks that were out there. We started to understand this massive oceanic battlefield. But how do we convey this sort of idea of a battlefield to the American public? It's very complicated. It's a huge place, and there's one particular story that sort of emerged as a really good sort of microcosm of that idea of a battlefield, and this was the Battle of KS-520 convoy. So this was kind of a classic convoy that took place, and ultimately resulted in the loss of the German U-boat that attacked it, as well as some of the vessels that were in the convoy. So this sort of discrete single-day event that happened right off of Cape Hatteras, we thought could be really representative of this idea of a battlefield. And so by May and June of 1942, we'd really started to get better about convoy routing, about communications, about blackouts, and really started to turn the tide of the U-boat threat off the East Coast. It's actually pretty remarkable. You'll see some historians talk about how unprepared we were. I think it's more interesting to just show how, most of our effort was focused in the Pacific because that's where public perception was. But going from January, where we had almost no ability to engage in anti-submarine warfare off the East Coast, to July, we had effectively pushed U-boats off of the eastern seaboard. It's a pretty impressive feat. And this KS-520 convoy is sort of the signal to the end of that period. This happened in July 15th of 1942, when air coverage and communications and convoys were all becoming much, much more effective, and it was becoming much less of a good deal for the Germans to operate off the East Coast. So KS-520 is a convoy designation that stood for Key West South. It was a convoy of 19 ships that assembled in Norfolk, Virginia, and were headed to south to Key West, and were escorted by 5 military vessels, Coast Guard and Navy, as well as had consistent air coverage for the duration of its route. So it assembled on the 14th of July and headed south around Cape Hatteras, and on the 15th encountered the U-576. So U-576 was a Type 7C German submarine that had been operating off of the East Coast for some time. It had actually sustained some damage a few days prior. It reported back to U-Boat Command that it had sustained damage to its ballast system from an aerial depth charge attack. They moved offshore. They must have felt that they had repaired that effectively, and they moved back inshore to continue hunting merchant vessels. And you'll see here, this is the crew of the 576 in the conning tower, and you'll see this large feature, this big hula hoop looking thing to the right there. That is the radio direction finding loop. So this is the system that the U-boat had to intercept merchant vessel transmissions and try to identify where they could go and target merchant vessels. So this is similar to the technology that would have been in the Maritime Center there. So the 576 came back into hunt off of North Carolina, and it intercepted the convoy at midday on July 15th, and it fired a full bow salvo of 4 torpedoes into this collection of 19 vessels. All 4 torpedoes struck their targets. A Nicaraguan freighter called the Bluefields was sunk within minutes. 2 other vessels, a Panamanian vessel and an American ship, were also struck. The J.A. Mowinkle and the Chilori were both struck, but they didn't actually sink. They were sailing in ballast. They didn't have cargo. They were on their way down to the Gulf to pick up cargo. So when a vessel was sailing in ballast, they were less likely to sink. They had some ability to control flooding and buoyancy. So they limped out of the battlefield, and unfortunately, directly into a friendly minefield off of Cape Hatteras. So there was a series of submarine mines that were placed to create a safe anchorage off of Ocracoke and Hatteras. That they unfortunately struck up mines and were further damaged, but the Mowinkle was ultimately refit and put back into service. The Chilori sunk up in the approaches to the Chesapeake Bay before it could get back to be serviced. But the Bluefield sunk immediately. Now, when the 576 set out these 4 torpedoes, it was at periscope depth, and as soon as they jettisoned these 4 torpedoes, that's a loss of a huge amount of weight. And normally they would compensate for that loss with their ballast system, which we know had been damaged previously. So as soon as they jettisoned those 4 torpedoes, the U-boat popped to the surface, smack in the middle of the convoy, which of course is exactly the opposite thing that you do with your submarine. You want to go down and evade counterattack. So it popped to the surface in the center of the convoy. The Navy Kingfisher aircraft that were providing air cover swooped in, straddled it with depth charges, and a armed guard crew, a naval armed guard crew aboard a merchant vessel called the Unicoi also opened fire and fired a 3-inch deck round into the 576, sinking it immediately. So within just about a 15-minute window, you have both elements, the Axis powers, the Allied powers, all engaged in this classic kind of convoy battle, and then sinking with representatives of both sides of the story, probably within relatively close proximity to each other. So we thought if we could find this place, this would really be a great place to understand and interpret and showcase this place as a battlefield. So we spent a couple of seasons doing just that, trying to search for this site. This is an example of some of the wide area surveys that we did. We started off looking really far afield, really wide, really low resolution to cover as much ground as we could. And then we'd get these little targets and try to come back and do higher resolution assessments of those things. So we centered our search really more around the blue fields, because it was a larger vessel with a lot, stuck up a lot further from the bottom, or so we suspected, than the U-boat. So we thought, oh, if we could find that, the U-boat's probably within a couple of miles of the blue fields. And so in 2014, we were successful in identifying a vessel that we thought was a pretty good candidate for the blue fields in about 800 feet of water, 35 miles off of Cape Hatteras. And we had to wait a little bit of time until we could go do a broader assessment. This is an example of multi-beam sonar image where you see on the right the site that we had identified. And then off to the left here, there's this other little chunk, which is about 250 meters away, that we thought might be part of the same ship. But we were very curious to know. And when we returned with a higher resolution system, we were able to collect this image of that site off to the left. So we were very pleasantly surprised that these vessels, not only were they within a couple miles of each other, they were within about 2 football fields of each other, sitting on the bottom there, untouched since they went down on July 15th, 1942, completely intact, and really serving as a pretty remarkable battlefield to this particular convoy battle. So we spent a lot of time then trying to document and characterize these sites so that we could share them and get people to understand what's out there just a few miles from our shorelines. Even though it's only 35 miles away, it's 800 feet deep, and working to kind of peel back the ocean so that we can see these places is one of the roles that we play at NOAA, and collecting this research data helps engage folks with these resources so that we can better understand and protect and memorialize these things. So in 2016, we were able to get down and visit this site for the first time since it was lost. It's sitting unbelievably intact on the seabed. It's I've spent a lot of time on a lot of shipwrecks, and ships on the bottom is exactly where they're not supposed to be generally. But this U-boat is in about 700 feet of water, so it's within its operational depth, and it's just sitting there like it was waiting. It's just unbelievably intact. It's in a place that it was operationally capable of being, and it's just kind of resting on its starboard saddle tank. And both the bow and the stern are still actually up off of the hard bottom. You can see every element of the vessel still intact. So we were able to explore this site and document it and collect as much imagery as we could to sort of virtually raise the vessel so that people could see what's there. We did this by conducting photo and video surveys, but it also collected a really high resolution laser scanning survey, which we did by means of the small manned submersibles that we utilized to collect this really highly accurate record of what the vessel looks like as it sits off of the coast of North Carolina there. It's pretty remarkable. It's the only vessel I've ever been looking for with a sonar that you could identify positively from the sonar imagery alone. It just looks like a model of a ship, just sitting there ready to go. We weren't actually able to observe any damage. One of the goals that we had was to try to identify what actually sunk it. Was it the aerial depth charges that were dropped? Was it the 3-inch deck gun? But we were able to really not discern any damage at all. Now, the only thing that's gone from this vessel is the wooden decking. So it's possible that the 3-inch shell only makes a small hole. Could be under the framing of the deck that we just can't see. But all of the hatch covers are still locked down, and the vessel is still totally sealed. So a really remarkable place, and you know, a real privilege to be able to look at this site and then hang a right and putt a couple of meters away and see the bluefields just sitting on an even keel, just adjacent to it. So it's a really, truly a remarkable place, and we're working hard to understand this history as best as we can, to share and interpret these stories, but also hopefully to ultimately protect these sites for future generations, and do interpretation and research through the establishment of an expanded National Marine Sanctuary to encompass these vessels that are representative of this battlefield that we feel really represents the American theater of World War II and pays homage to the sacrifice of the Merchant Marine, the story of the Merchant Marine, and we're hoping that we can achieve that in the future. So I think I ran just a few minutes over, but there's plenty of time for questions, and I'll take them now.
Okay, thanks, Joe. That was absolutely fascinating. I think your work to preserve these sites, if you will, as battlefields is incredible. I mean, I never thought about, you know, underneath the ocean is actually a battlefield, and really the work that you are doing is honoring veterans as well as lost lives in that arena. So just really amazing work. Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. Is just out of curiosity, is any of your work published yet? Is it on a site where, if our audience is interested in seeing more of this, that they could go?
Yeah, if you go to monitor.noaa.gov, we have a lot of this information on that website. There's links to some of the expedition pages. So every year that we've gone out to do research, we've hosted expedition pages that have some of our results, as well as stories from the field and images of these sites. Not just the U-boat sites, but the vast majority of these sites are the merchant vessels themselves, and just an incredible amount of information there. So that would be a great stop. I can send you, Liz, I can send you some links to things if you want to share them with your email list. That'd be fun.
That would be great. That would be great, because I'm sure it's a fascinating topic, and just even the technology that you're using in the work you're doing is and how you're doing it is very interesting, let alone the historical significance. So thank you very much for that. So it is time for a Q&A. So we do have a couple of questions popping up, and I will just a reminder, you can hover your mouse, there's a Q&A icon, and type them in. And so we will start on that. So Bruce is asking Joe whether there's a similar effort covering outside New York and Boston harbors.
There's been a lot of work that's been done on a lot of the vessels that are up there. NOAA does not have any active efforts underway off of Boston or New York. But there are many shipwrecks that are associated with those places as well, up off in New Jersey and New York and sort of Long Island area. I've been up there and dove on many of the sites that are there, but we don't have any sort of active effort underway to engage with those sites. But they're actively dove by the recreational community. There's a lot of really unbelievable resources there, but we just made the determination to kind of focus in on this particular area because of its representative nature, and the concentration of vessels that are off North Carolina make it pretty unique. And the accessibility as well is another kind of compelling thing about this place in North Carolina, is that there's a really active recreational diving industry there. So not only do these sites exist there, they're accessible. So the sites of New York and Boston, you can get to them, but they generally are a little bit, the conditions are a little bit more difficult for divers. They're often often deeper, colder, and lower visibility generally. So it's doable, but from a public engagement interpretation standpoint and access standpoint, there's a lot more accessibility in North Carolina as well. So that's an added bonus for this region.
I see. Yeah. So I think what was so surprising is to hear you say this was what, 25, 35 miles off the coast of North Carolina?
I mean, they were close. There's stories of the U-boats, seeing headlights from people driving on shore. And there are actually a couple of instances where they landed agents. They landed some agents in Long Island and then Jacksonville, Florida, that were sort of, saboteurs that were meant to go around and, damage shipyards and manufacturing facilities and other places. They ended up kind of turning themselves in, and it's called Operation Pistorius. It's a really interesting history in of itself, but they were dropped off by U-boats on the coast as well. So they're actually on boots on the ground, not a lot, but
yeah. And I think there's some stories about being very close to us as well. And here's another question. This is from a viewer, Liz, and she says, what lessons were learned from the finding of the blue field and the U-boat?
So we're still kind of analyzing some of the data from them. We're hoping to get back out to these sites, but some of the questions that we were asking were kind of understanding the last few minutes of that engagement, particularly as it related to the 576. I think I mentioned that it had both an aerial attack as well as a surface 3-inch deck gun round was fired into the pressure hull as well. And so we were interested in understanding that, and there was a lot of question around why the 576 popped back up into the center of the convoy. So I alluded to this, but it's kind of an interesting question where the U-boat had been attacked a few days prior. It moved more than 100 miles. It was like 125 miles offshore, where it radioed back to U-boat command in Berlin. Actually, I think it was in Saint Nazaire in France. They reported damage. And it had indicated that the damage was so significant that they were going to return to base. But they didn't do that. As the last transmission that was received from them. And they must have felt that either they weren't going to be able to make it back to base, so they'd come back in and continue their mission, or they thought that they had fixed their whatever problem to their ballast system enough to where they were operational. So one of the questions was, did they try to, would we be able to see any evidence of the damage to their ballast system? Would we be able to see whether or not they ditched in the water column? So, a lot of times with some of these things, you end up with kind of more questions than you started with. And all the U-boats had the capacity for the crew to ditch through. There were multiple points of egress through the galley and the conning tower, a couple of you could get out through the torpedo loading hatches, and they had these little ditch rebreather systems that they could get out from a sinking U-boat and get to the surface. And that's actually exactly what happened with the U-701. It only sunk in 120 feet of water, and majority of the crew got out after it had already hit the bottom and popped to the surface from 120 feet. And so we were curious if the crew tried to ditch, and it looks like they didn't. All of the hatches were still closed. And one of the things that we don't have enough information to answer this question, but a question that kind of arose from the assessment of the site was, because all the hatches were closed and it's in an area that it would have operationally been capable of recovering from, whether or not it looks like it's possible that it settled on the seabed, and maybe it was waiting out the counterattack to try to resurface again and just was unable to do so. but there's no evidence of anyone trying to get out of it. So it kind of raises the question of, was it sort of in a controlled manner settled onto the seabed? Because the way that it's presented, it doesn't look like it slammed into the bottom. Where if you look at the blue fields itself, it's largely intact, but there's a big gaping torpedo hole in it, and the area that it actually hit the seabed, you can see sort of evidence of it impacting the seabed. The sediment is disturbed and sort of ruffled up around it. It looks like it smashed into the seabed. The 576, which is just 200 meters away, doesn't look like that at all. It's settled perfectly on the bottom. And these vessels, the Type 7 U-boats, were a double-hulled vessel. So what that means is it had an internal pressure tube. So it had the submersible component, the watertight component was this kind of internal tube, and it had all this sort of trunking and piping and air flask and instrumentations, all this stuff that was attached, to the tube, which wasn't very hydrodynamic. So they would then have sort of an outer hull, what we call like an outer hull fairing. So it's just a little more delicately built outer hull structure to make it hydrodynamic. That wasn't watertight. That's where you see in that in the laser scanning, there's a series of kind of perforations along it because it was meant for water to kind of flow freely in and out. It's a long way of saying that portion of the vessel was comparatively more delicate than the rest of the vessel. And it also has these U-boats by design have these sort of horizontal rudders called diving planes on either side that stick out, and they're comparatively quite delicate relative to the rest of the vessel, as well as at the stern there's dive planes and rudders and two propellers, all of which again is not really meant to smack into the bottom. And so those areas on the 85, the 576, the 701, all these vessels that are in pretty close proximity to this site, albeit a little bit shallower, all of those outer hull fairings are damaged substantially. Now they're in a little bit more dynamic environments, but here in the 576, that they're completely intact. Both bow diving planes are sitting up off the seabed. Actually, the bow and the stern of the vessel are up off the seabed almost to amidships because they're resting on the saddle tank. So it looks like it sort of gently, it either just sort of slowly drifted down as it sank, or it was deliberately settled there and then just never able to get back up. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
Well, thank you for that. So it sounds like it's still a bit of a mystery as to what or how the U-boat actually sank or was sunk.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it was one or a combination of those two factors, but it would have been interesting to sort of see some of the definitive evidence of this damage. We were most startled to see just how structurally intact the site still is. So.
Yeah, and that's one of our viewers had that observation that it looked like it was fairly intact. So another viewer has a question about, is there any plan to raise the U-boat?
No, there's no plan to raise the U-boat. So there are 45 sailors that are still inside. We've consulted with the German embassy. It is regarded as a war grave. They have no interest. It is still their property. They have no interest in disturbing it. We work with them to make sure that the research that we're doing is done sensitively and respectfully, but there is no plan to recover it. And I think that from the standpoint of its sort of value as a resource, it has more value being where it is, sort of representing this place and this time, because as we kind of talk about this idea of a battlefield, and I'm sure that many of you have probably visited historic battlefield sites. And, you know, when you walk out on that battlefield, it's unbelievable. You get a great sense of place. The interpretation is wonderful, but, you know, it's been mowed, you know, it's been landscaped, and a lot of times they were used in other capacities for, you know, decades or more. And so we do our best to reconstruct those places and interpret those places and make them feel like they might have felt at the time of, you know, the significance that's being interpreted. But they've been altered in the interim, right? Just by virtue of where they are. What's interesting about these places, and this place in particular, because it hasn't been found and because of its depth, it's completely as it was. And that's I think a unique and special thing. And as, you know, I kind of talk about this a lot, where, you know, when we first established the site of the Monitor in 1975, 250 feet of water is where the Monitor sits. It's not far away from where this, where the 576 is at all. They're really kind of close together. 250 feet was deep. It was inaccessible. And now there's a recreational diving industry that can, you know, sees that people get into 250 feet of water all the time. It's just the technology and accessibility of that technology has changed to the point where these places become more accessible. And I think we're a ways out before it's, you know.
Yep, I think we might have a little bit of a technical problem here. So
common place for somebody to go. Did I cut out?
Sorry, Joe, I don't know if you can hear me, but I think the internet connection just had a bit of a bump, but you're back.
Am I back?
Good. You're back. Good. Yeah.
So my again, my long-winded point is that I think that, you know, we had the ability to get to this site with these small 2-person submersibles that were privately owned. It was a private-public partnership that we did that with. So these places, I think, and, you know, the Monitor was, you know, 40 years ago, and a lot's changed since we've been managing that site. I think if we project outward 40 years, these places may be more accessible than we think at the moment. So I like the idea of keeping it pristine.
Yeah, which actually is, Fran had a question about that. When you say pristine, is there an effort to maintain or protect that underwater battlefield, or is it just by documenting it?
Yeah, so we have, within the program that I work for, the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, we have the ability to establish protected areas to manage these types of places. So the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary, which is just a few miles away from this site, has been exploring the possibility of expanding the boundaries to include a representative representative sample of this battlefield. So that's an effort that's underway to actually create an expanded protected area to include these sites for you know, our ability to interpret them, share them with the public, and make sure that they're properly managed into the future.
Okay, thank you. And just another question from Janet and Gary. You've sort of talked about this a little bit about the German government and offering the U-boat to them. Did they participate in the locating it and doing and in part of the research that you were doing? Whoops, Joe, I think we have an unstable connection again. So we'll just give you a moment to come back, hopefully. All right. So, all right, I think we may have, unfortunately, there he is. Okay, Joe, we had a little bit of a connection problem.
At least it got through the bulk of the presentation before the internet started.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, so we've coordinated closely with the German embassy and the naval attaché in Washington, the German naval attaché. So they've been aware of everything that we've done. We've briefed them on all of our findings, but they haven't been engaged operationally with us.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Just one final question from viewer Liz. She would like to know that this is obviously a huge area. What is the approximate size of what you're defining as the battlefield?
Well, that's a tricky question. I mean, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, to a large degree, the Battle of the Atlantic was the whole Atlantic Ocean. As we sort of zero in on these particular areas that are representative, I don't know if I can sort of share my screen again here. We did this modeling to try to get an understanding of where the highest concentration is to be sort of representative. Let me try to pull this. Sorry. Can you see that? Oh,
Not yet.
Sorry. The highest concentrations are an area off of Cape Hatteras. And is that, here we go.
Are you sharing there we go. Now we can see it. Yep.
Sorry. Yeah, so if you look at this area, this is kind of a heat map of the density of battle events off of North Carolina, which gives you kind of an idea of the scale. There's a scale bar at the bottom that's 100 miles in linear distance. So it kind of covers this whole area, but those areas that are red, particularly that area off of Hatteras, is sort of the area that we focus in from a protection standpoint as a representative, but it's kind of spread across the whole area. And there's a number of different models that are under consideration for, having sort of a central battlefield box, maybe a couple of districts centered around the Capes. So we've kind of been kind of conceptualizing what areas are the most representative, but I think in the truest sense, it's really the whole ocean.
Okay, thanks. It is a big battlefield, or it was a big battlefield. So we really appreciate your time, your explanation, and certainly your passion and devotion to your work. It's just it's an amazing effort to preserve our history and our legacy. So thank you. So in appreciation for your time, and I know all of the effort that you put into this, Joe, I'd like to present this Chatham Marconi Maritime Center hat for you, and
awesome.
we'll get it off in the mail. So and great. Then you're certainly invited to come visit with us at any time.
I'm eager to get up there. You're not far from Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, where we've got a presence up there. So I get up there from time to time. I'd love to swing by and check out the facilities there.
Oh, absolutely. We would be pleased to have you. And again, thank you so much for your time and your presentation tonight.
My pleasure.
Fabulous. And I want to thank all of our viewers tonight. The questions were fabulous, and for participating. And this is our final program for 2020. We look forward to seeing you in the new year. And we're probably all a little happy that 2020 is over. However, we are thankful that you have all helped us succeed this year, whether it's through volunteering, memberships, donations, visits, and by being part of this virtual presentation. So with heartfelt gratitude from all of us at Chatham Marconi, we wish you happy holidays and good night.